In 1973, a factory worker named Brian Holroyd in Halifax took home £22 and 14 shillings every Friday in a brown wage packet. His wife Pauline fed the family of 5 on £7 of that, paid the rent, the coal club, the Christmas savings club, the catalog installment, the co-op dividend account, the television rental, and the rates, and still had enough left at the end of the week to put 10 shillings in the post office savings book. She did not have a budget spreadsheet, she had a system, and the system worked. Number 11 on this list was used by nearly every working-class family in Britain and across France, Germany, and the Netherlands in the early 1970s, and has so completely disappeared from modern financial life that most people under 50 have never heard the term. Number 6 was a collective financial arrangement that entire streets and entire workplaces organized among themselves without any formal institution, any interest charge, or any paperwork, and it returned more money to its participants than any savings account available to working-class families at the time. And number 1, the method at the very top of this list, was not a financial trick or a savings product or a consumer strategy. It was the entire architecture of a household economy built on a single wage in an era of genuine inflation, and its disappearance has left nothing in its place except debt. These are 20 ways that ordinary European families stretched their money further in the 1970s, practiced in the kitchens and front rooms of working-class Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands during the decade of the oil crisis and the highest inflation that most of Europe had seen since the 1940s. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because what Pauline Holroyd understood about running a household on a genuinely tight wage was not austerity as a political position. It was domestic engineering of a sophistication that no modern financial advisor has ever matched. Let us count them down. Number 20, the Coal Club. The Coal Club was one of the oldest collective savings devices in the European working-class financial repertoire, a scheme in which a group of neighbors or workmates contributed a fixed weekly sum throughout the summer months to a common fund used to purchase coal in bulk at the autumn price before winter demand drove it up. A coal club of 20 members each, contributing 50 pence per week from April through September, accumulated £50 by October, which in the early 1970s purchased between 8 and 10 tons of coal at the pre-winter wholesale price, enough to supply each member with 400 to 500 weight at a cost significantly below what they would have paid buying it week by week. The Coal Club was self-organizing, required no formal management beyond a trusted treasurer, and returned its value entirely to members in the form of cheaper fuel. When North Sea Gas Central Heating replaced coal fires through the 1970s and 1980s, the Coal Club became unnecessary and quietly wound up. Number 19, the Christmas Savings Club. The Christmas Savings Club, sometimes run by the corner shop, sometimes by the workplace social club, sometimes by a voluntary organizer in the street, collected weekly contributions throughout the year and returned the accumulated sum in December in time for the Christmas shopping. The contribution was typically between 25 pence and £1 per week, accumulating to between £13 and £52 over 52 weeks. Unlike a bank savings account, the Christmas Club paid no interest but charged no fee and provided something that no savings account could: the social commitment that meant you did not touch the money before December because the club would notice and your neighbors would know. The discipline of the collective arrangement was the product, and it was worth more to most working-class families than any interest rate. When the supermarket's own Christmas savings stamps and the collapse of the corner shop removed the institutional homes for these clubs, most dissolved. Number 18, the Catalog Club. The mail-order catalog, the great universal stores, or the Freemans or the Gratin, or their French and German equivalents, was in almost every working-class British household in the 1970s, and the woman who served as the street's catalog agent was providing a genuine financial service in exchange for a commission on orders she collected. The catalog agent in Britain in the early 1970s collected orders from between 20 and 40 households on her street, distributed the delivered goods, and collected the weekly installment payments. Her commission of approximately 10% on orders she processed returned between £2 and £4 per week to her own household from a service she was providing anyway as part of her normal domestic network. When catalog ordering moved online and the commission agent model was replaced by individual account management, the catalog club dissolved. Number 17, the buying co-op and bulk purchase ring. In every working-class street and every workplace canteen in Britain, France, and Germany in the early 1970s, there was someone who organized collective bulk purchasing of goods that benefited most from scale. a buying co-op of 10 households who shared a quarterly order of dry goods, tinned food, soap powder, and household cleaning materials from a cash-and-carry warehouse could reduce individual spending by between 15 and 25% compared with buying the same goods individually from the corner shop. The organizer typically took a commission equivalent to £0.5 or £1 per household per order, covering her time while still leaving members substantially better off. When the supermarket's lower everyday prices undercut the advantage of bulk purchase, the buying co-op lost its economic rationale. Number 16. The clothing exchange and nearly new sale. The nearly new sale at the church hall, school, or community center was a regular feature of the working-class social calendar throughout the early 1970s. Families with children, whose clothing requirements changed faster than the clothing wore out, sold their surplus garments at near-cost prices to families whose children were slightly younger and smaller. A woman who dressed her 3 children entirely in nearly new clothing through the 1970s reduced the family's annual clothing expenditure by between 30 and 50% compared with buying new, and the quality of the clothing at nearly new sales, made in an era when children's clothes were constructed to last rather than to a price point, was often superior to new clothing at equivalent cost. Number 15. The Mutual Loan Circle. The informal rotating credit association, known in Britain as a tontine or mutual, and in continental European forms as a cring or casse, was a collective financial instrument in which a group of between 10 and 20 individuals contributed a fixed sum each week into a common pool paid out to one member each week in rotation. A mutual loan circle of 12 members, each contributing £1 per week, returned £12 to each member in turn over 12 weeks, providing a lump sum that no individual member could have saved from their weekly income in that time without the social pressure of collective contribution. The circle required absolute trust among members, drawn from people who knew each other well enough that default was a social catastrophe rather than merely a financial one. When consumer credit made lump sums available through credit cards without social commitment, the informal circle lost its primary advantage. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. Because the methods described so far have all been collective, involving groups of neighbors or workmates in shared financial arrangements. But the next entries describe the individual and household strategies that Pauline Holroyd and millions of women like her used to manage their weekly housekeeping money, with an efficiency that the modern consumer has entirely forgotten how to achieve. Number 14. The wage packet system and the envelope division. The brown wage packet that Brian Holroyd brought home on Friday contained the week's take-home pay in cash, and Pauline divided it at the kitchen table on Friday evening into named envelopes before a single pound had been spent. Rent, coal, Christmas club, catalog, rates, housekeeping. The envelopes were not metaphorical. They were physical envelopes into which physical money was placed and from which it was spent, so that the housekeeping envelope was the only one accessible for daily expenses, and when it was empty, nothing more was spent until the following Friday. The cash envelope system made the budget physical and therefore impossible to lose track of in the way that a bank balance seen on a statement can be overlooked. When bank accounts replaced wage packets in the 1980s and wages were paid by direct debit into accounts accessed through cash machines, the physical discipline of the envelope system dissolved. Number 13. The television rental and appliance hire purchase strategy. In the early 1970s, most working-class British households rented rather than purchased their television, paying between 50 pence and £1 per week to a rental company such as Radio Rentals or DER that maintained and replaced the set whenever it developed a fault. The rental strategy made economic sense for a household that could not find £30 to £40 in a lump sum but could manage 50 pence per week, and the maintenance contract ensured a faulty set was replaced without additional cost. The same logic applied to hire purchase of washing machines and refrigerators, paid for in weekly installments over 12 or 24 months. When consumer credit expanded and lump sum purchases became possible through bank credit, the rental market contracted, though the rental logic has since returned in the form of subscription software and streaming services your grandparents would have recognized immediately. Number 12. The school clothing grant and the utility allowance. The British welfare state of the early 1970s provided a range of means-tested benefits supplementing working-class family income in ways since consolidated, restructured, or eliminated. The school clothing grant provided a lump sum at the beginning of the school year for uniform and shoes. The utility allowance provided a rebate on electricity and gas bills for qualifying households. Free school meals for working-class children removed one meal per day from the household food budget. A working-class family in Britain in the early 1970s that correctly identified and claimed all means-tested benefits to which it was entitled could supplement its income by between £2 and £5 per week, a meaningful addition to a weekly wage of £22. Number 11. The Co-op Dividend and the Trading Stamp Collection. The dividend paid by the Cooperative Society to its members on purchases was one of the oldest working-class financial mechanisms in Britain, returning a percentage of every purchase as a quarterly cash payment to account holders. In the early 1970s, the co-op dividend ran at between 2.5% and 3.5% of purchases, meaning a household spending £5 per week at the co-op received between £6 and £9 per quarter as a dividend payment, a genuine and predictable return on ordinary spending. Trading stamps, the equivalent mechanism at non-co-op retailers, operated similarly. Green Shield stamps from Tesco were collected and redeemed for goods from a catalogue, effectively returning between 1% and 2% of grocery spending as goods. When the supermarket price wars of the late 1970s made it impossible to fund dividend and stamp schemes alongside discounted prices, both mechanisms were eliminated. Second pattern break. This next one is where the real financial engineering lived. Because the methods described so far have been about managing money more efficiently, but the next entries describe the specific ways in which the most financially sophisticated working-class households of the early 1970s turned the constraints of the one-income household into a system of deliberate wealth accumulation, building assets on wages that 21st-century financial advisors would describe as too small to invest. Number 10. The Premium Bond and the Post Office Savings Certificate. The national savings products, available through the post office in the early 1970s, offered working-class savers a range of instruments that no commercial bank was willing to provide at comparable terms. Premium bonds, purchased for £1 each, entered their holder into a monthly prize draw, offering tax-free returns from £25 to £100,000 with no risk to the original investment. Savings certificates offered a guaranteed tax-free return of between 8% and 12% over 5 years, at a time when commercial bank savings rates were significantly lower after tax. A working-class household that put 10 shillings per week into savings certificates through the 1970s was building a guaranteed tax-free return at rates the financial industry has never since offered to ordinary savers. Number 9. The allotment as economic strategy. A working-class family in Britain in the early 1970s with a productive allotment that grew potatoes, runner beans, onions, leeks, cabbages, and soft fruit was spending between £3 and £6 less per year on vegetables than an equivalent family without one, and the allotment rent was typically between £2 and £5 per year. The return on the investment of the allotment rent was between 600% and 1,000% per annum in direct food cost reduction, a return that no financial product available to working-class families in the 1970s came close to matching. Number 8. The Car Sharing and Errand Sharing Network. In a decade when many working-class households did not own a car, the informal car-sharing networks of working-class streets provided access to transport for the domestic errands that required it. The quarterly trip to the cash and carry, the annual trip to the out-of-town market, the occasional hospital appointment. A woman with no car but 3 neighbors each with a car who would take her on specific errands in exchange for the same reciprocal service had access to transport without the cost of owning a vehicle. Number 7. The Holiday Savings and the Boarding House System. The working-class family holiday of the early 1970s was the annual week in a boarding house in Blackpool, Scarborough, Morecambe, or the French or German equivalent coastal resort, booked a year in advance and saved for throughout the year in a dedicated holiday fund separate from the household's other savings. Full board at a fixed price per person per week meant predictable cost, no restaurant bills, and the familiarity of a landlady who had been seeing the same families for 15 years and knew their children's names. Number 6. The Neighbor Lending and Borrowing Economy. A household that borrowed a ladder from a neighbor rather than hiring one saved between 50p and £2 per use. A household that borrowed a carpet cleaner rather than renting one saved £1.50 or more per use. A household that borrowed a sewing pattern rather than buying it saved between 15 and 30p. Across a year of regular borrowing and lending within a network of 4 or 5 mutually trusting households, the saving represented by items borrowed rather than purchased was between £10 and £25, a genuine addition to the household's effective income. Third pattern break. Here is where the story becomes most personal. because the final entries describe not financial instruments or community systems, but the interior architecture of the household itself, the way in which the space and equipment of the working-class home in the 1970s were managed as productive assets rather than consumption goods, and the way in which the domestic skills of the woman who ran the household turned the physical resources of the home into economic value that no wage packet or welfare benefit could have provided. Number 5. The productive kitchen and the preservation calendar. The working-class kitchen of the early 1970s was managed on a production calendar that ran through the year. In August and September, the surplus from the allotment and the glut prices at the market were the raw material for preserving, pickling, and jam-making that stocked the larder for winter. In October, the bulk purchase of potatoes, apples, and root vegetables from the farm gate provided winter storage at prices significantly below the retail cost, bought weekly through the cold months. A household that followed the preservation calendar spent between £5 and £10 less on food through winter, a saving of between 10 and 15% on a weekly food budget of £7. Number 4. The make do and mend philosophy applied to furniture and household goods. A chair with a broken joint was re-glued rather than replaced. A vacuum cleaner with a worn belt was repaired for 10p rather than replaced for £15. A curtain too short for a new window was extended with a panel of matching fabric rather than replaced. The household that maintained its furniture and equipment rather than replacing it at the first sign of wear was accumulating the difference between replacement cost and repair cost as a form of household wealth, even though it appeared in no balance sheet. Number 3. The subletting of the spare room. A working-class household in Britain in 1974 that let its spare bedroom at £7 or £8 per week was supplementing Brian Holroyd's £22 and 14 shillings by between 30 and 35%, effectively converting a tight single income into something that functioned economically like a comfortable 1.5 income. In an era when the oil crisis and inflation had eroded the real value of wages faster than wage increases could compensate, the lodger's contribution to the household budget was more significant in relative terms than it had been in the more comfortable late 1960s. Number 2. The deliberate limitation of consumption as a value rather than a constraint. The working-class household of the early 1970s that managed its money well was not merely reacting to constraint. It was expressing a value system in which consumption beyond immediate need was understood as waste rather than as pleasure, and in which the accumulation of savings, however modest, was understood as the appropriate use of the surplus that careful management produced. Pauline Holroyd did not feel deprived because she put 10 shillings per week in the post office savings book rather than spending it. She felt prudent, and prudence in the working-class household of the early 1970s was a genuine virtue, respected by neighbors and transmitted to children as the most important lesson of domestic life. When consumer credit made it possible to spend tomorrow's money today, and when the culture of consumption elevated the spender above the saver, this value system was not defeated in argument, it simply became unfashionable and then invisible. Number 1. The single wage as a system rather than a limitation. At the very top of this list sits not a saving technique or a financial strategy or a community institution. It sits the entire mental framework of the household that understood its single wage as the fixed perimeter of a closed system and managed everything within that perimeter with the ingenuity and discipline that the closed system demanded. The £22 and 14 shillings in Brian Holroyd's wage packet was not a constraint to be overcome by credit. It was the raw material from which a functioning household life was to be constructed, and the construction required the full deployment of every technique on this list simultaneously. The Coal Club, and the Christmas Club, and the Catalog Commission, and the Co-op Dividend, and the Allotment, and the Borrowing Network, and the Preservation Calendar, and the Envelope System, and the Sublet Room, and the Maintenance Philosophy were not independent choices. They were the components of a single integrated system, and the system worked because every component was understood in relation to every other one. What replaced that system was not a better system. It was credit, which allowed the household to live beyond its wage at the cost of paying interest, which further reduced the household's effective income, which required more credit, which is the economics of the descending spiral, rather than the closed system. Your parents and grandparents ran the closed system not because they were forced to, but because they understood, in a way that 40 years of consumer credit culture has made it very difficult to understand, that spending what you do not have is not a solution to the problem of not having enough. It is a postponement of the problem with compound interest attached. Pauline Holroyd balanced her household to the penny every Friday evening and went to bed knowing that next week would be manageable. She did not know she was applying sophisticated household economics. She called it making ends meet, And she was right. The knowledge is still here. They knew. Now you know too.